To reflect now on what I've learnt about trust. Trust I'd taken for granted. I just trusted in trust, as it were, because it surrounded me. And I thought that it was natural and that I was just like everyone else and that my culture was like everyone else in relation to trust. So, what do I mean by trust? Well, trust is the confidence in other people, the assumption that unless there's some particular reason, another person will treat you reasonably, fairly, in a kind and thoughtful manner. And therefore, you can take risks. You can share confidences with people. You can lend them money. You can set up an appointment to meet them and they will be there, and so on. So basically, much of our social lives is based on the assumption that other people are trustworthy. It applies in our games. You trust that the other members of your team will play well with you, that the opposition will not foul and cheat, and so on and so on. It applies obviously in economics hugely. Much of economic activity is based on trust and future good behavior. And even in relation to religion, we believe and trust in Jesus, etc., etc. So it's terribly important. It's one of the most important features of any society, the level and degree and kind of trust. And as I grew up, I found myself an extremely trusting young person. I think there are a number of reasons for this. Above all, I suppose it's my close family, because I found in my parents in particular, my mother and my father, people who never really let me down. I knew always that they loved me, that they cared for me. They put me before themselves very often. And even when I left them, or they left me when I was aged 6, and subsequently again and again because they were away in India, I never lost my trust. My mother wrote to me every week and showed a deep love, so I trusted them. And this was also the case with my grandparents, who brought me up a lot of the time. My grandmother was quite a volatile and powerful lady, but she never was cruel or untrustworthy, and likewise my grandfather. So in those relationships, and then it was echoed in my schools, because when I went to a boarding school at the age of 8 3/4, and throughout my schooling, I was taught how important it was to trust other boys and to trust each other in games and in our social lives. And our teachers instilled trust. I trusted their judgments about my work. I trusted that they would be fair to me in their reports and everything else. And I never really had any cause to question that. And indeed, the whole social system of boarding schools was based on trust. For example, in the second boarding school, you went from being what was called a fag, a very junior boy, up to being a prefect. And when you were a prefect, you were given a huge amount of trust. The headmaster, the housemaster would summon you and say, "I'm going to make you a prefect, Alan, and I'm going to give you quite a lot of power. You can discipline boys, you can organize their lives, and I won't interfere. I trust you to do this in a reasonable and fair and just way." I mean, this is a training in leadership and in being trustworthy. So trust was everywhere, and I continued through my life, and it's been an enormous advantage, I think, because it's meant that when I meet people, I don't check them out all the time. I assume that they are what they say they are, and that I can enter into a reasonable relationship with them. And so much of my joy in life, friendship, love affairs, everything has been based on this emotion or feeling of trustworthiness. What I've learnt, though, is that this is unusual. I learnt, of course, that I was not absolutely the norm, that there were other boys who seemed to be suspicious and cynical and not trust other people. I learnt from literature, particularly, for example, Shakespeare's plays and Jacobean drama and other things are filled with discussions about can you trust someone. In Iago or in Macbeth or in Hamlet or in other plays, you learnt about what happens whether if you trust someone too much or too little. And English history was scattered with examples of people who were too trusting or too untrustworthy or whatever. So I learnt about it in abstract like that. But in my personal life, I led a life suffused with trust. When I became an anthropologist, I discovered something else, which was that this general feature of trust and trusting people and gentlemanly behavior and the rest of it that I'd been brought up, trained in, and assumed was rather unusual. I learnt that in most societies, trust can be found in people who are close to you, particularly your relatives, close relatives. But you wouldn't trust someone from another village or another community. You wouldn't trust someone necessarily from another kinship group. And so suspicion and wariness, a Machiavellian attitude. Machiavelli is a great example of don't trust anybody, get your defense in first, etc. That attitude is very widespread. It's found in most peasant societies where you don't trust the government, obviously. You don't trust more powerful people. You don't trust strangers. And in such a situation, life is made much more complicated because everything that you want to achieve has to be surrounded with mechanisms to enforce the action to take place. For example, in Sicily, if you want to buy a cow, you don't just go and say to someone, I'll pay you some money and you give me your cow. You go along with a member of the local mafia who stands there, and both of you say this contract in front of them, and then if one of you doesn't carry it out, then the mafia will punish the person. They enforce trust. Now, the question then is, why did England in particular, and I think Anglo-Saxon societies are most notable for their trust, why did this develop? Well, there are a number of theories which I've looked into in my various books. One most obvious one is the legal system. There is a very powerful legal system, and you know that if, particularly in economic and other transactions, you break your contract, then you can take it to law. Likewise, if someone behaves badly, we had a system called equity or fairness courts, equity courts, and if some powerful person or a man or someone behaves unfairly towards you, you can go to the court and try them, get them tried. So this legal system was a terribly important guarantee of trust. And the second one I investigated a great deal was the setting up of trusts with a capital T. And the legal historian Maitland described how they'd been set up as a mechanism to get round tax. But later they became all important. And trusts are based on trust. You trust someone, or you trust the people who you set up to look after your estate to carry out something which they don't absolutely have to do, but they do it out of friendship and trust. So trust breeds trust. And that was the lesson of my life, that trust breeds trust. If you trust someone, they usually, not always, behave in the way you hope, and likewise yourself. So trust is a fascinating idea and terribly important in my life and that of many people. Thank you.